All right. Well, I think it seems we are ready to start off with this first panel discussion. Having heard the inspirational and the impulse speeches in the opening discourse. So my name is Laetitia Thyssen. I'm a senior policy analyst on gender equality at FEBS, and I'm particularly delighted to moderate this panel in particular, which has been already hinted at multiple times by the speakers previously, and so here we will be discussing precisely what does feminist foreign policy mean in times of crisis, and how can we make the women peace and security agenda a must-have rather than a cosmetic afterthought. In fact, I think it's pretty clear that feminist foreign policy is very much about a long-term strategy. However, feminist foreign policy also requires short-term answers, particularly as we live in very troubled times marked by crisis and conflict, as is already becoming evident in the recent weeks and months. Just over the past 3 years, we have been experiencing a pandemic. We are still going through a global climate crisis, the Russian war of aggression, the women's rights attack in Iran, Afghanistan, and not least the current situation that is happening in Israel. So the increased need for responsiveness also demands for a capacity to integrate strong gender considerations in ad hoc and emergency responses. And so therefore gender responsive tools are truly essential, and in that regard the Women, Peace and Security Agenda is clearly a must in that context. Perhaps the most known measure is the UN Security Resolution 1325, which has influence that is extending into countless governments and international organizations, and which was adopted in 2000. Back then, it was truly unprecedented, because it was the very first time that the fact that women were suffering disproportionately from conflicts was being acknowledged at the highest international level. However, this resolution, although we may also call it a revolution, is only part of a broader agenda that is known by most of us as the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which is building on 4 main pillars, including the participation of women in peace-building process, first. Secondly, conflict prevention by the inclusion of a gender perspective. Thirdly, the protection of women and girls in armed conflict. And last but not least, gender-specific help, reconstruction and reintegration through relief and recovery measures. So these points will be what we will be addressing and interested in today's session, in order to consider the real policy impact on people in the receiving countries. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our honorable set of speakers that is joining us today in order to address all these important and ambitious points. Unfortunately, Jonna Neumann, Senior Advisor to the EU Ambassador for Gender and Diversity from the European External Action Service, is excused today because she had an unforeseen commitment. However, I'm delighted to introduce you to Daniela Sepulveda Soto. You are a project director at PEFAL, the Platform for Feminist Foreign Policy in Latin America. And you're also a political scientist from the University of Minnesota, having also had experience in the Chilean Ministry of Defense. So welcome with us.
Thank you.
On my left, we also have Romana Michelon, who is the Secretary General of Women in Security Brussels. You are a political scientist, expert in conflict resolution, security, NATO, and the European External Action Service, having also had a professional experience in NATO. So welcome with us as well. And then joining us online, we also have Salma Malik. I guess she will appear very soon, but I will already take the time to introduce her. Salma is joining us from Pakistan. She's an associate professor from the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, having specialized in conflict and security studies, and now we can even see her. So a very warm welcome to you from Brussels, dear Salma. So without further ado, and perhaps also here to address the main issue at stake, I'm actually looking at Salma, because I would like to ask you to start this conversation. What makes the Women, Peace and Security agenda so important? Could you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure, honor, and delight for me to participate all the way from Pakistan. Countries which are countries such as mine, which have adopted the WPS, but not much has happened on that front. And it is so fascinating and such a huge honor to be in a company of illustrious feminists and women and powerful men who are bringing so much change to the world. I'm looking at the WPS from my country's perspective. There are several things that need to be mentioned here. One, of course, is the fact that Pakistan has been in the grip of conflict internally as well as externally in the neighborhood for the longest time. Since the 1970s at least, Afghanistan, which is our next door neighbor, our western neighbor, has been in a state of conflict. And as a result of that, there has been an inflow into Pakistan of Afghan nationals. And of course, as we are all very much familiar, that majority of the people who seek refuge are the non-combatants, including women, children, elderly, and so many other. And as the time progressed, we saw another occurrence happening once the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan was finished, that the civil war started, and soon after the civil war, 9/11 and post 9/11 developments occurred. So, Afghanistan, our neighboring country, has been in this state of flux for 40 years minimum, and that is contemporary conflict. The previous conflicts I'm not talking about within the country. Correspondingly, what we then saw as a result of the 9/11 developments in the neighborhood.
Chile, for example, has already 2 national action plans and is working in the 3rd plan to be published somehow soon. However, despite the good prestige of Chile and Uruguay, in my opinion, their plans are mainly testimonials. They are like letters of good intentions, and a way to assimilate their interest to the interests of other countries, especially from the global north. And the problem with these different approaches is that actually they tell us a lot about the tensions between the North and the South. In the last 23 years, since the publication of the 1325 resolution, we have seen that the WPS has universalized and standardized objectives to be applied in contexts that may differ from each other. And the problem is that establishing peace, maintaining peace, observing peace, building peace, and even negotiating peace have different processes and purposes. Yet, the uniformity continues to be a very distinctive element of the UN presence in peacekeeping operations. For this reason, the integration of the analysis of feminist foreign policies is crucial, I would say, to understand the new phase of the WPS implementation, especially in Latin America. As Professor Jennifer Thompson said, we have seen an explosion since 2014, an explosion regarding the publication of feminist foreign policies in the global north. And it is not a coincidence that most of these countries are actually NATO members. However, the feminist foreign policies are no longer the choice of only advanced industrial societies from the global north. As you may know, for example, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico have publicly committed to feminist foreign policies in the last 3 years. The question is, why small and medium countries pursue feminist foreign policies? And in general terms, I argue that they do this to obtain international status, establishing recognition as progressive, and distinguish themselves regionally. And in some way, the adoption of feminist foreign policy is a commitment with liberal values that the Global South identifies as a key piece of international hierarchy, and therefore it helps to secure recognition and legitimacy from the Global North countries. And this has critical implications for the WPS agenda because it can be a risk, but also an opportunity. a risk because these countries may keep reproducing again and again a passive assimilation of foreign external interest, but it can be also an opportunity because finally maybe we can start writing the WPS implementation agenda and efforts from the priorities of the Latin American countries. So in conclusion, I would say that the proliferation of feminist foreign policies in Latin America is, of course, an ally of the WPS agenda, and the European Union has an important role here. In its core ideas, yes, the feminist foreign policy strengthens Western democratic values. However, and this is the message I want to give here, however, global North countries must recognize and accept that this process may also open questions from the South, especially from countries observing that the current emphasis are not transformative enough. And I would say that this is a very important critique that the Latin American feminist has regarding the emphasis of the liberal feminists promoted for certain countries in the global North. So I'm gonna stop there, and then we can keep.
Well, I think thanks to Daniela, indeed, we get a really good overview and understanding on what the Women, Peace and Security Agenda means when it's implemented at national level through those national action plans. However, this can also have very concrete implementations and meanings when we speak of international organizations. And so that is also precisely why I'm now turning to Romana, from whom I would like to hear more of what this means when it comes to its implementation, particularly if we look at organizations like NATO or the EU, for instance.
Exactly. Thank you so much to the organizers of this event. I'm really delighted to be speaking to such a large audience this morning, and really very excited that WISE Brussels is represented. Those of you that don't know who we are or what we do, we are an international NGO with a Brussels-based, very active chapter that really seek to increase the participation of women in this bubble, primarily referring here to the institutions, of course, that are active here, both EU and NATO and even beyond, but also that seek to advocate more gender mainstreaming in all the external policies of these organizations. I was asked to think about and share some thoughts and some of my ideas on the implementation of women, peace and security. I'm glad it's such an easy question. And I thought it would be appropriate to actually start out by dispelling one, I think, of the greatest myths that exist around women, peace and security, which, by the way, is I think, a myth that practitioners of feminist foreign policy share, even scholars of feminist IR share, which is that supposedly the agenda or the agendas are so very complex that you need to be a doctorate, have a PhD in order to understand what this is all about and implement it in practice. I think this is not true. I think there's patriarchal reasons why people would say that, because I think at their core, whether we speak about women, peace and security, whether we speak about feminist foreign policy, again, feminist IR, what we're talking about is, in terms of security and defense in any case, an acknowledgement and understanding that different people experience war and conflict differently. Men, women, and on that spectrum, everything in between, not everyone's experiences of war and conflict are the same. And that in order for peace and peaceful outcomes of conflict to be sustainable, those experiences simply need to be factored in everything that we do in achieving an end to war and conflict. That's it. Implementing, I think, is a very different story. I think that's where the complexity really lies. Your feminist foreign policy, your women, peace and security agenda is only as strong as the way in which you implement it. And through my work in NATO, I worked in the Women, Peace and Security Office for 3 years, but also beyond that in WISE, I have seen, I think, characteristics of solid women, peace and security implementation that certainly help. So one thing that I tell anybody that's working on women, peace and security is to identify, formulate really realistic goals and objectives, which, and I know that this sounds really counterintuitive, sometimes means lowering your level of ambition. So setting women, peace and security objectives and priorities doesn't mean intending to change the world in 3 years by an arbitrarily set deadline or by anyone's political mandate. It's really about defining objectives which can be implementable in time. I invite you all to actually look up some of the action plans that NATO, that the European Union, but also at the national level have been created and formulated, and sort of challenge yourself. If you were in charge of implementing some of the objectives in there, do you think that would be practically possible? Sometimes the answer is very much yes, and sometimes it's no. So one advice we share with people that we speak with in this regard is set realistic goals and objectives. I think secondly, and this goes without saying, the Women, Peace and Security agenda really needs to be formulated, implemented, monitored, and evaluated inclusively, and as inclusively as humanly possible. What do I mean by that? I think that means a Women, Peace and Security agenda. I'm glad we have speakers from different parts of the world represented here today. It needs to really be locally owned and not imposed from above, which tends to be, it's an ugly habit that some of us have in maybe global north and definitely also in this city. We need to very much not do that. But not just that, and I speak as a representative of civil society here today. Obviously, diverse civil society organizations need to be involved, again, not only in implementation, but also in formulation of objectives, as well as, and this is also key, the monitoring and evaluation of women, peace, and security actions and action plans. And by diverse civil society organizations, I also mean, women's civil society that may not agree with one another. Because as we know, women are a diverse, very much not homogeneous group either. We are not a monolith, and it's okay. It's okay to disagree with one another, but come together around that table and at least discuss. Women, peace, and security is, or should in any case be, for all people, including all women of all creeds and sort of all convictions. And lastly, when I say inclusive, I also mean invite the non-like-minded to the table. This is difficult, believe me, I've been there. But I think especially, and I regret Joanna isn't here, but especially when one tries to implement women, peace, and security in the big international organizations, there's corners of the building where people will ignore your email when that comes in. There's people who will see your number and not pick up the phone just because they know what you're going to be, quote unquote, bugging them about. It's those people that I think you need to invite to the table early on and really convince or sort of argue with them. This is why this matters to you, and this is how together we will work on implementing change sustainably. Very lastly, I didn't want to start with this because it's such a sad point to make, but I think more resources are needed as well. As women, peace, and security practitioners, I think we're often asked to change the world for free, and that is just not how that works. But when I say resources, I also mean human resources. I wish this information was a little bit more public, but if you look at the organograms of the women, peace, and security teams, be they in national foreign ministries, be they, again, here in town, in Brussels, or in the EU or in NATO, you will see that comparatively these teams are ridiculously small, and that's absurd. And I think private sector or the hourly rates, if you would to calculate that, of people actually working on women, peace, and security is obscene. No one should be tasked with this kind of work and get so little. It's such a thankless job in the end. And perhaps very, very lastly, if I may, the sort of standardized, indeed, way in which we've been working on women, peace, and security since 2000 is, of course, through the drafting and the agreement of national action plans, or action plans in case of the international level. Anyone that's ever taken a look at them will see that national action plans or action plans are composed of, objectives, outcomes, intermediate outcomes, long-term, short-term, action bodies. It's a very almost corporate project management approach to the implementation of an agenda. And what we often say, and what also my experience has been, if this works for you, at the national level or wherever else, then absolutely by all means continue to develop those national action plans. But if it doesn't, then don't feel constrained by it either. I think that we are in incredibly critical times in the world, and I hope we get to touch upon why women, peace, and security matters so much today. We want to reach our objectives, and it's really not necessarily done through national action plans that needs to be done. So however we find ways of implementing the agenda, whatever works for us, I think we need to embrace that. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much for this. I see that Professor Malik is not yet reconnected, so what I would suggest to do is to ask you two further questions, if you allow me to, so that we also secure space and time for questions for the audience. So this is also an appeal to you, so that if you want to ask your questions to the speakers, do not hesitate to engage with us and to interact. But perhaps also picking up on the points that you just made before I turn back to Daniela, because I think this is really crucial. And yourself having had such an important role also in establishing women in security at NATO, for instance. What has been also the role of women within these international organizations like NATO, known for being marked by very masculinist and patriarchal structures? So how can we make these organizations more feminist and more progressive? Perhaps you can also tell a bit more about some concrete initiatives that have been happening there.
Yeah, absolutely. Always happy to talk about why is at NATO. It's a very loose and informal community of women working in particularly NATO HQ. It came about, honestly, very randomly because the WISE Brussels activities that we would organize, and prior to the pandemic, all of them would be in person. Women NATO staff simply wasn't able to attend because of the sort of where NATO is, where the building is. It's by the airport. If you have an hour lunch break, there's just no way that you can make any events on time. And there was a clear demand within NATO and within that community of women to set up a sort of subchapter of WISE with them. I would say, and this is departing a little bit from the women, peace, and security focus of this conversation, but it's almost a support group. Women working in NATO have generally speaking quite the hard time. I like to respectfully compare NATO to the Vatican a little bit, which is just going back in time, and change is absolutely coming, but it's just coming very slowly, and it's coming well sort of after the rest of the world seems to have picked up on change. So women in NATO can have it really, really tough, and the group exists to bring those women together to network in ways that men very, very much know how, and women are not often given opportunities to get to know each other. When there's new senior leadership joining NATO, we invite them to speak, introduce themselves, and also talk about sort of their professional journeys. How did you get here, and what are your expectations? But then obviously there's also a really substantive portion to the WISE at NATO group as we talk about NATO priorities coming up, or say summits coming up, and what women within the organizations feel should be directions taken. And then also talking concretely on how do we get that message and those messages across to the right people in the building. So I would say WISE at NATO is a truly kind of feminist expression of need for solidarity amongst women, and an acknowledgement that women at all levels have remarkable substantive contributions to make to policy discussions in this case, this organization, and really try to effect in that regard slow but nonetheless sustainable change. The group is now, I think, 6 or so years old, and it's unthinkable that it wouldn't exist, which I think is testament to the need, and the need for it to also stay on. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this. And now, before we move on with the Q&A, I would like to, first of all, ask Daniela, because earlier on, you were also very much highlighting, perhaps also in echo with the impulse in introductory speech, on how FFP is also sometimes embodying very different meanings according to where this is implemented, particularly from the Global South perspective, where it has been established that many times the focus is on how they implement it themselves at national level, whilst we also do see that in some other cases there is often a tendency to focus more on the external action and looking at it as only a foreign affairs issue. So how do we also, first of all, ensure coherence between domestic and foreign policy, but also how are the recent events like the ones that we see currently happening in Israel illustrative of the challenges to implement the gender perspective and the gender mainstreaming of foreign action?
Doing every day is trying to apply the standards of the North in the South, mostly because we get the funding from the North to apply this agenda in the South. The problem with this is that the standard is so high and doesn't communicate with the structural limitations we have in Latin America, that what we see at the end is just frustrations in implementation efforts. I have seen that especially with the WPS agenda. So when we talk about the importance of the local and how to strengthen the local, I invite you to see beyond the borders of the WPS agenda. We have organization of women working in women's participation to improve security matters or to increase peace efforts and all that for more than 5 decades, even before the existence of the WPS agenda. But the problem is that all the funding is going directly from governments in the North to governments in the South to apply the WPS with these standards and leaving other organizations just empty of content, funding, and people. And that's a problem. That's a problem that I fear it may happen, for example, in the context of the new developing wars we are seeing today. So I'm not saying that we should leave the WPS, of course, I'm not saying that. But this is an invitation to see beyond these borders, because it's creating, for real, a disaffection, especially when the help, assistance come from specific countries in the global North to the global South. So I would say I don't have the answer. The only thing I have here is trying to deliver a message about the necessity to be careful in the way we push the implementation of this agenda in the South. Because believe me, it's creating problems. It's creating a lot of problems. I'm sorry if that's not enough.
In the face of these different challenges, I would like to now give the floor to you. I saw already several hands raised, starting with Anne. So I think the colleagues are here to also bring some microphones, so we could perhaps bring one here in front, and then also afterwards to my left.
You go ahead. No, I wouldn't take time from the Q&A, but I just need to say something. And that is, it's a very, very big difference if you have already from the beginning a feminist foreign policy in those issues of women, peace and security. Yes, it should come from below, but it has to come also from the top. Let me just take you one example. I was chair of OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. You have both the personal mandate, you are elected as chair, and the country. And then we decided to have the feminist foreign policy also in all the international organization. That meant that for all the 15 military missions that OSCE has, I demanded that they did a gender analysis. And that meant that you should see how is this mission affecting women and girls. And you can say, for example, when it comes to missions, say one in Africa, for example, if you don't have special soldiers seeing where are the women, then they are not protected. And it happens in many cases. I mean, there is worse cases where the soldiers were standing where they were collecting water, then they raped them systematically. And in one country, after they've raped them, they cut off one ear. so that when they went back to their village, they were kind of out of the thing. Immediately after we finished our chairpersonship in OSCE, they took this away. And we had 3-day meetings with all the military advisors in Sweden about gender analysis in military missions. And first, many of the male, because they are all male, military advisors said, we won't come because this is just bullshit. And then after 3 days, they say, oh, there are so many things to think about. We haven't thought about that. In many, many different, and in the coffee break, I can tell you more about it. But it has to be systematically, otherwise it won't happen. And by the way, in NATO and in EU and in OSCE, we always have meeting with the female foreign ministers at the NATO summit. Now, we are not a fully member yet. As you know, there are 2 men who is not promoting us. But we still take part, and those meeting with the foreign defense minister in NATO and in other is very, very important. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you for this contribution. Please introduce yourself before asking the question.
Sure, with pleasure. My name is Sandra Malone. I'm from Search for Common Ground and Zancora Consulting. First of all, thank you, Laetitia, and thank you to Salma and the 2 of you for your panel. My question is short, and it follows well from Anne's intervention there. I just want to know more, if we could please, about who the allies are, where the entree points, the leverage mechanisms that you've observed in your experience, where they are, and how do we just find that sweet spot to make feminist foreign policy and the Women, Peace and Security agenda anchored in ways that are appropriate, whether it's Latin America or anywhere else. Thank you.
Okay, second question just next to you.
My name is Claudia de Castro Caldeirina. I've been working on gender equality and leadership for 20 years, including with Margaret Wallström. One of the questions actually comes from what you just mentioned, and overall my thinking about this. When we have women, like yourselves, like Margaret, like Elga at the moment, we can see this leadership, okay? We can see this drive from the top that you're saying, and then it becomes an issue, and then it becomes a trend, and then it gets into resources and policies, etc. We haven't seen as much when we have, and it touches a bit what Sandra was touching, on allyship. We haven't seen as many male leaders take this agenda. I don't know if it's because of the F word. I don't know if it has women, and therefore they don't see that it's also a benefit for them and for the other 50% of humankind. So the whole, is it the way we're communicating about this so that they are not fully on board and understanding this is actually a win-win-win-win-win for the world, for people? So my question would be about that, and I actually, you are on the panel and you're amazing, but I actually would love Benedicta and Linden, Mrs. Linden, to also talk about it if possible. Thank you.
Thank you for this one. Is there a last question I may collect before we turn for the round of answers? If not, I would actually, if you allow me, add one myself as well, because you've been also stressing the importance of civil society and activists, and so I think here this is also complementary with Anne was saying, but in a way, how can we also ensure that we can mobilize, for instance, sufficient EU funding in order to empower them to have the adequate tools and be effective on the local ground in order to implement FFP and the WPS on the ground. So here we have 3 questions. I'll let you perhaps pick and choose the ones that you are most comfortable with, and together with our extended panel, I will also give back the floor then to Benedicta and Anne Lind.
Yeah, can I add one question? Now? Okay, I would like to add one question for you, actually. You said, you said in your presentation that this information apparently is not public, but about the composition of the WPS teams working on the ground or something like that. Is there a way to access that kind of information that is government information, UN information? And yeah, I'm curious about that. And it's about only the north, the south, and all that? Well, yeah. Thank you. So I can start answering if you want. I'm going to try to join your question and the question about the allies of these agendas. I would say that in the case of Latin America, the most important allies we have are, of course, progressive organizations, political parties that are crucial in this task. And also, of course, the feminist movement in Latin America, which is super, super strong. And actually, that is what, I'm sorry for talking about the organization I'm representing here, PEFAL. PEFAL is a platform for feminist foreign policy in Latin America, la Plataforma para la Política Exterior Feminista en América Latina, PEFAL. And what we are doing there is actually joining all these organizations that are key to keep improving the implementation of the WPS and trying to keep the efforts of the feminist foreign policy. But at the same time, I have to recognize that it's impossible to do a job like this without funding. And the funding we are receiving right now comes actually from the global north, and specific from organizations like Open Society Foundations. And I have to say this because, as you have indicated, we cannot do this work for free. If you want real advocacy, you need to have people working 24 hours in this task every day. Otherwise, the implementation efforts and the idea of questioning governments about their implementation efforts is not going to be complete. I mean, you have to have people working on this all day professionally. So I would say those are very important allies. And also I want to talk about some emphasis promoted in this organization, or for example, in PEFAL. When we talk about implementation and we talk about the local, we always think that the local is the south, is the small, is the underdeveloped. I challenge you to think about this in different ways. As I said before, we have organizations working on these topics even before the existence of the WPS, and they have been doing this, working with different countries. It's transnational advocacy in some way, so we cannot talk in small and local terms. And it's important to recognize too that when you have certain countries indicating the emphasis or the standards we should apply here, in these organizations as PEFAL, we are questioning that, because it's like, how can you tell us what to improve, what to fix here, if sometimes your country is not doing enough to implement these efforts? I mean, we're talking about feminist foreign policy. You have countries like the US promoting this, but they don't have a feminist foreign policy. Maybe they need help. We don't know. So I think that I just want to highlight here that allies are important. Global North help is important, is critical, because that's funding. But at the same time, I challenge you to think beyond the borders of the local, or of the small, of the South. I mean, we in the South, we are actually participating with many organizations in the North, trying to improve their implementation efforts too. So the direction of the help is not always the way we think, right? So, yeah.
The floor goes to you.
Yes, thank you very much for the really, I think, good and important questions. Let me start by who are our allies and how do we get to them? How do we get them to work with us? I want to say there's different ways of looking at that. So the easiest way is to go on the basis of what is, say, at the national level, a country's declared commitment to gender equality. You know, you can look that up and then see for yourself, this country is my ally and this country isn't. But I think that that's not enough, because what we see, of course, in practice is that within the multilateral institutions that all of us are seeking to influence in some way or another, there's individuals working on these files that may be more or less in the position to, or may more or less sort of convinced of the need to implement any kind of agenda around gender equality. So I think what is key here to find out who those people are and see what room for maneuver they have, which may very much depend on what's going on in the world as well as the countries that they're from, but work with them as agents for change, and change here defined also as the smallest change, then perhaps just striking one line in an intended statement at a meeting is sometimes, that to me is also change, right? So it's about finding the right people. And then lastly, I would say, try to really connect on substance. So not just, don't stay high and above in abstract terms, talk about gender equality is important because gender equality is important, obviously, but find concretely what that means for them. An example I can give, I used to work with colleagues in a part of NATO called defense investment, which is arguably the most sort of military technical part of the organization. Not only did I not know exactly what they were working on, they had also no idea what it was that I sought to achieve with them. So what was important here was to sit together and figure out what are the connection points. And we actually found that around women's uniforms and how they needed to be adapted and adjusted to the female form to enhance their security in armed conflict and war. So it was a bit of a journey, and a very technical one at that, but we, at the end, really connected through substance. That was a win-win for us. So I hope that answers your question. In terms of your question on communications and branding and the male leaders and allies that we need, I think it's a really good point. I mean, we are, in WISE, we're not naive about our name. It's Women in International Security, which is both helpful and unhelpful sometimes. It's a name we've inherited and a name that I think means a lot of positive things to many people, which is why we like to keep it. But at the same time, if I'm a man and I see it's Women in International Security, will I join that event? Say, do I feel like it's for me? So I think here the responsibility is on us, and we're trying to do that in different ways, of targeting men and making sure they're there, making sure they understand they have a very important role to play, and also to dispelling this other myth that it's men versus women and that we're all really angry at them, which sometimes is true, but definitely not always. Your question about civil society then, and how to get that funding, I think from our experience in WISE, and this is it's a little sad because it's not, I think, something that everyone can accomplish. It's important to be both in and out of the organizations from whom you seek the funding. So as if it wasn't hard enough to work substantively on the sort of topics that we work on, you also need to understand the languages of the organizations that might fund you, their priorities, what are they currently looking at as you draft your grant proposal and as you hope to get that funding. Fundraising is an enormous part of what WISE Brussels does, and it's a sad reality, but it's a reality nonetheless. And then to your question about the information, yeah, I think the EU is a lot more open in terms of the composition of its staff, the compositions of its teams than NATO, and here I say respectfully also can be, because there's reasons why those registries aren't made public. But I think though not able to Google who works where, there's obviously ways of figuring out who works where, and here the Brussels bubble is particularly small. So I think a key portion in this also is to fundraising, is to build that internal network, to really get to know the people that sit where, get to know who they speak with, who do they say are their allies, because then maybe they can become your allies. So it's very much about going beyond what is Googleable and really building an informal network, which, by the way, events like these are really helpful for. Yeah.
Thank you for this. I'm looking back at the audience just to make sure I didn't miss out any raised hands. don't hesitate to do so, because this is really an opportunity also to engage with us, because I'm sure that we have as many inputs from your side as from our side. But we also had promised a reaction by Anne and Benedicta, so perhaps you would like to react to what was mentioned earlier.
Okay, so on the issue of allies and who should we be discussing the implementation strategies and the adoption of FFP with to make it successful, I would say, first of all, the political parties. Maybe because I'm a political junkie, but I find that the policy-making process of every government starts from the party level. And so I was just having a conversation with my colleague from Netherlands and was asking her about the upcoming elections and all the developments of the platform. And she was like, yes, I managed to get FFP as one of the platforms that they are going to go into the elections with. Now, that there is what would make a government commit to undertaking any effort in that regard. And as Secretary General, I've been traveling, meeting parties around the world. And one thing struck me, that the logo of the Socialist International has been adopted as the logo of a lot of parties in the world, our member parties, with no changes. It's just the name that is attached to the logo, and they adopt it. What we do at the international level, the agenda we set. So, for instance, if the SI, if FEPS, if Progressive Alliance, if we set an agenda to mainstream the conversation of feminist foreign policy when we have engagement with our parties and prioritize that policy as I said before, a development strategy, and try to actually get the parties to appreciate what this means, not just to women, but to their countries. I think that becomes a way of getting them to really own the process rather than waiting for them to be in government and then going in to try to lobby for this. Then on the second issue about the local actors and what that means, I appreciated what Daniela said, that sometimes we think about local in terms of size and think of actors in that space as small organizations. Yes, they are small organizations, but it's just taking your mind out of what you think should be done on the ground and really engaging with the key stakeholders on the ground to try and understand what it is that they appreciate, what are they thinking of when they hear feminist foreign policy. Try to dispel some of the myths, but also encouraging them to see why it is important. Until we do that advocacy and explanation and taking our time to strengthen the relationship that exists between the global north and the global south, or countries that are implementing this policy, we really would be talking at cross purposes without even realizing it. So that's just the 2 points I would like to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I think I totally agree 100% with Benedicta that it is important to get the political parties into it. And I also think it's important that you try to broaden it. I mean, if you say that the F word is problematic for some politician, the P word also is it, the progressive. But I can tell you what was very, very hopeful and interesting. There is a new commissioner from the Netherlands in the EU Commission, Wopke Hoekstra, and some people think he's not progressive. I heard that on the things, but I can tell you that he was the party leader of the Christian Democrat. and a family man with several kids. And one of the first journeys he did when he became foreign minister was to Stockholm, one of the very first meetings, because he said, I am a feminist, and I've heard about your feminist foreign policy, so tell me what it is. And we talked about this for hours, and this was like February or something. And then he went back to the Netherlands, and he convinced his government that the Netherlands should also pursue a feminist foreign policy. And after a few months, they did. And I mean, politically, we are opponents. We are not at all the same party. But when it comes to seeing the need for a feminist foreign policy, we really, really, joined arms, and the Netherlands did that. Now I hope they will continue when he has become a commissioner. But you always need to have partners to do it. And I also think it's important that we try, to reach out also to progressive parties in the world that is not party political, because it's not a good situation as what happened in Sweden, that the first decision without even thinking, they abolished it. I can tell you that is, we want it to continue, we want it to be long-term, so we want to tell politicians how important it is. And I think in election campaigns, like now in the European election, that you need to have a strong push from civil society, from women's group, but also from other groups to the politician, that we want you to stand up to pursue a feminist foreign policy. I mean, when it started in Sweden, when we decided to have a 50-50 men and women in the government, that was in '94. I mean, that's like nearly 30 years ago. 94, and the reason, I would say, was that there was some feminists that were so pissed off with what was going on in politics that we form our own party. We form a feminist party, which they did later, actually. But at that time, all the party leaders had to, kind of witness in the party leader debate, we will commit to more gender equality, we will commit to a 50-50 in the government, and so on and so forth. And we, from the Social Democratic, we won that election, and we had a first government that was 50-50, and it became so self-evident that every government, right-wing, left-wing, whatever combination of party, has not even thought about changing that. So for 30 years, and from now on, it's always 50-50 in the government, and nearly the same, nearly all parties, all the, not the populist party, but all the other parties, including the conservative, the centrist, the Christian Democrat, they have separate list to the parliament. So I think if you can get it to be more normal, who would think we shouldn't have 50-50 in the government or in the parliament? Then you have come a very important way. But then you need allies also on the other side of the political spectrum. And I think that is also important.
Thank you very much. I see that unfortunately we will need to close and to bring this panel to an end. However, as has already been promised earlier, there is going to be the coffee break, so you will have ample chance also to further exchange on that. I think today's session has been extremely enlightening in highlighting the important role, the importance of applying a feminist perspective to situations of conflict and peace negotiation process. This, of course, has very concrete and immediate results and implications for women and girls directly impacted in those situations. We cannot help thinking of what is currently happening in the Middle East with the situation of hospitals being attacked, with the situation of humanitarian aid to being blocked on the border, and all of this needs a gender reflection. How do we ensure that the specific needs of women are addressed? How do we ensure that their health demands and needs needs are also addressed in an adequate manner. So all of this makes it only all the more important and makes the case that today's discussion really could not be more timely. I would like to thank our speakers particularly for highlighting the importance to think global, think not just of what it means from a theoretical perspective, but also from a practical ground, that we need all allies on board. We need to bring civil society with us. We need the adequate funding in order to be able to implement the set measures. We need the political will. We need feminist and progressive actors in order to make this happen. And so I would like to close this session simply by by stressing that if anyone thinks that feminist foreign policy in times of a war and crisis is not the priority, they should just think again, because without feminism, there is no peace. So thank you very much, and I enjoy the coffee break.